All right, good evening. I'm glad that you're here tonight. We're going to be opening up to 3 John. We'll be finishing that up tonight. 3 John. Last week we'd covered the first major portion of the text. We just got a couple of verses left. A few things I wanted to talk about that we kind of left off with last week, though. If you remember what this letter is about, it's written to a person named Gaius, and it's had to do with encouraging him, talking about a number of things that John has repeated in the other letters we've looked at. John, like any writer, has some things that seems like he kind of hones in on, some phrases, some concepts and ideas. He repeats those over and over again. And he's giving those same words here in many ways to Gaius, and then he starts to talk about, he talks about his hospitality, the importance of him being loving, being caring for those that are coming to him, the example that he's setting. And then he turns to talking about this person named Diotrephes that is the exact opposite of those things. It says that Diotrephes was essentially the antithesis of a hospitable Christian. He was turning people out. He had, it seems like, had kind of taken the local congregation where he was and kind of turned it into almost a dictatorship with him at the top. And so we talked about his name a little bit and some things we might infer about who he might have been. We really just don't have a lot of information about him, but based on his name, which is kind of unique for that time and era, was possible that he was maybe rather high up in society at least, kind of part of the aristocratic society, maybe wealthy, and probably used a lot of those kind of things, his position in life, to make people see things his way or to push them or bully them into doing things the way that he thought they should be done. And so as John is writing this letter, he's focusing it to Gaius, and the main focus seems to be what Gaius is dealing with this person, Diotrephes, and Gaius is trying to help get the words of John and other writers, other teachers to the church, trying to help them stay on the right track, keeping himself on the right track. And there's a major difficulty that's arisen with this person, Diotrephes. And so last week, as we talked a little bit about what the Bible said that really he was doing, there's 4 main things that are given that he's is accused of. He's prating against them with malicious words. He's not receiving the brethren, which is what John had spoken so highly of Gaius doing, receiving those brethren that he knows and also those that he doesn't know, those that are strangers to him as well, that he was hospitable to them all. He says that Diotrephes also, not only does he not receive the brethren, he forbids those that would. So those that are acting in defiance of what Diotrephes sees, essentially he's condemning them and coming down on them probably in many ways that we don't have recorded. And then it says that he casts them out of the church, that essentially you might think of it as he's the one that holds the membership rolls. He's the one writing the names down of who gets to be a part of this church and who doesn't. And you got to please Diotrephes in order to be a part of it. Otherwise, you're just out of luck. So it gives him this feeling of he takes this ownership of the church, a position that he has no right to have. That no person has the right to have. We're all supposed to be watchmen and keeping an eye out, keeping things out that shouldn't be in the church, but certainly not to the extent of like what we're talking about here. And Diotrephes, as John says, loves to have the preeminence, loves to be on top, loves to be seen first. So as we concluded last week, we'd begun talking a little bit about the question. This is where we'll kind of finish off this talk about Diotrephes, is how does a person like Diotrephes get not just to this position, but how is it that he's allowed to continue on for, we don't know how long really all this went on, but we've all known people like this, and it seems like that in one way or another, they have a way of finding a place that people will let them behave this way, and that people will even cower to them and do essentially what they say. And so it's an important question for us to ask as to, what are the reasons why something like this could happen? A place that we would assume otherwise was a group of faithful Christians, but here's a person that has essentially taken the church and just had his way with it, and if he has his way, has turned them completely against everything that Christ intended for his church to be. So how does a person get on with that? And I think the number one main point, Dan said at the end of class last week, that people, the biggest reason is that people don't really know the truth of what a Christian is supposed to be, how they're supposed to act. John has talked about that in the letters we've studied here about how do you put somebody to the test of whether or not they're a Christian. How can you be sure about yourself Well, if you're living and doing the things that Christ has told you to do, that you've been taught by God, well, then you should have no doubt about yourself or someone else. Diotrephes had a lot of words that he would surely make himself a convincing argument for what he wanted to do and what he thought. But if you compare it by his actions to what God has said is right and true, well, the difference would be pretty clear to see. But probably a number one issue was that there weren't enough people with a deep enough and sound enough knowledge of what the truth was to be able to look at this Diotrephes and say this isn't right, and to be able to then go on there from taking a stand. That's probably one of the biggest problems that happens in the church today, is not having enough knowledge to differentiate between things that are right and things that are wrong. Sometimes the things that are wrong seem an awful lot. They've got a lot of similarities to the things that are right. And it takes a diligent eye and somebody that's looking and really knows what the truth is to be able to decipher and see the parts of it that are lacking and to pull those out. And so, number one, people probably didn't have enough knowledge of really the truth in order to see how that these things of Diotrephes were wrong. In addition to that, maybe adding on top of that or other reasons beside that even, what are some things that come to mind of how something like this could be allowed to go on for any length of time? Yep.
I don't like, well, I'll just use myself for example. For a lot of years I saw things going on in the congregation that I was at, and I kept my mouth shut because I didn't have to participate in it. I didn't think it was right. I couldn't say that it was necessary. For example, they had a children's Bible out, and during the worship service, I never agreed with that. I didn't like it, but hey, I don't have any kids at that age, and if I did, I wouldn't send them to it, so I'm not participating in it, so it doesn't affect me. Yet, it's there, and it's going on, and it grated me. Can I say that it's right? No, I cannot. Can I say that it's wrong? I think I can give you biblical scripture saying that it's wrong, but is it worth then you have to ask, is it worth the fight that it would ensue? Now, several years down the road, and a lot of things have happened, I say, yes, it's worth the fight, and I should have taken it up.
Right.
Then another thing that happened in my own person, we had a preacher that I loved, but he wanted to do Sunday evening worship service with a Bible study type format. And that was good for a while until we had ladies asking questions and making comments. Now, is this worship or is this a Bible study? And everybody liked it, so I went to the elders with it, and that's why I'm here and not where I used to be, because it just I thought it was worth the fight, because 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verses 34 and 35 is pretty explicit on that. So
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few good points there about, and the biggest thing, in addition to, even if a person has enough knowledge to say what's right and what's wrong, is people that don't want to start the fight, don't want to raise the issue, and don't want to go through what it's going to take in order to make a difference here in a situation. Here we've got something that, and this can, sometimes issues like that, kind of like some of the things you're talking about, can have some different opinions and thoughts in there. Maybe there's some room for some back and forth a little bit. But whenever we're looking at something that is so clearly right and then something that's so clearly wrong, we've got to raise issues, and we've got to be able to bring them up to do it in the right way. We're not looking to just create division and cause a fight, but we've got to be willing to step in and say something. And certainly, if there's an issue going on in the congregation, whether it's something maybe you just have a question about or something you disagree with, want a better explanation of, well then, we should start by going to our elders, those that are overseeing and bringing up those concerns. Not attacking them, but bring them up in that way. We need to be bold enough to go to them and to bring those things up. Also think about, probably just based on what we read about this Diotrephes, I would imagine if you went to him and said, I disagree with what you're doing, what do you think his reaction would be?
Probably kick you out of the church.
You're probably gone. Yep, you're probably gone. And it's probably not going to be, hugging and good and a nice farewell. There's going to be lots of rumors said about you. You're probably going to be brought up that next Sunday, and if Diotrephes was the preacher, I don't know. He's going to make sure he can do everything he can to tarnish everything about your reputation. He's going to spread a lot of terrible things. That's what the Bible says he was doing. He was prating against people with malicious words. He's going to go after you. And one of the things that Christians kind of have to learn how to deal with is people that are going to act like this. And sometimes they even call themselves Christians. Sometimes they're our brethren for a time, and then they turn like this. Even in that, though, there's still a time at which a person has to be willing to take the lumps if that's what they have to do, when there's an issue important enough to bring it up and to stand for the truth on it. And that's really what John is telling Gaius to do, is that John knows and gives full credit to him for standing up and having voiced this problem, and tells him that you need to stand strong in these things. And he, later on in the verses we'll talk about to finish off this chapter, he mentions Demetrius, a person that's of a very good report. And he says, you need to look towards a person like Demetrius, somebody that is going to support you, encourage you. You need to be bound together like them and realize that, Diotrephes is not a person that you're going to have that kind of relationship with. And so that kind of aggressiveness, that bullying, that tearing someone apart, trying to accuse them of things after the fact that really weren't true, if you can kind of push them out, well, then you can say anything you want to about them, and they aren't there to defend themselves. And a lot of people are very shy about bringing things up because they're afraid of something like that, or maybe they've had it happen to them in the past. That's, again, something that unfortunately sometimes a person could find themselves in the middle of. But John is so clear that, look, God knows what Diotrephes is doing. He knows the difference. He knows what Gaius is trying to do and the struggles he's having, and God's going to be there in support. And John was trying to voice his support for him too. What else? Any other thoughts? Yes. Yep.
And the other piece to that is if they do enter into it, they probably run the risk of dividing the congregation, the Diotrephes side and the other side. They probably don't want that to happen either.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of reluctance there, despite what's the right thing to do. I think a lot of folks just want, hands off because they're comfortable too where they're at.
Yep. So, and there's a lot to talk about in that, probably more than we have time to get into tonight fully. But being afraid of causing a division among people and among a congregation, even, it is, and to that point, it's always important that if you're going to, raise an issue that you're afraid something like that can happen, it shouldn't be done just on a rash decision. I'm just going to fly off the handle and go on about this. There needs to be some consideration and some thought. Well, how is the best way I can approach this? Have some goals defined in mind. Here's what needs to happen for this to be made right. How do we go about trying to do that without causing a problem? But on the other hand, sometimes we can let, for instance, like what Paul said, of as much as lies within you, live peaceable with all men, or not to be causing divisions in the church. We can sometimes use that as an excuse to not bring up legitimate issues. And that's just as dangerous of trying to stay united whenever there's things that are wrong that are happening. When we're not uniting around truth, we're really not united at all. And we can go too far to one side or the other. There are people who go out trying to cause division, and that's really what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 12, about there should be no schism or division in the body. People that are trying to divide you like that, they need to be stopped. They need to be put out. You don't need to be listening to people like that. You need to be peaceable with all men. There's a difference in that and somebody that is dealing with a real situation. Like there's a Diotrephes here. How do we go about dealing with it? And being ready to take a stand to the point that, if there's a group of people that are going to follow Diotrephes to that extent that they would leave the rest of us, well, we got to be willing to, if that's the choice they make, to let them go and to do that. But we're going to stand for the truth no matter what. And trust that God knows what's in the hearts of all these people on all sides, and that those things are going to work out for the best one way or another. Any other thoughts? Yes?
There's other easy ways that could be, with some still apply today. For instance, if he actually was a wealthy Greek aristocrat, he may have been the one funding the congregation.
Money.
So
Mm-hmm.
you have someone who contributes because they're so wealthy, 25% of the budget, which that more applies to today.
Yep.
But that does that, you're hesitant to
Yep.
upset the court about that.
So sometimes we don't have the attendance boards on the walls in here like a lot of places do, but we're watching that the contribution week to week. That can be a major factor too. That somebody thinks, if that person leaves, there may be a big contributor. or maybe something that person's contributed in the past. Maybe just take, for instance, our building. If somebody had paid for the vast majority of it and made it possible, and then later on there's a problem with that person, a spiritual problem. Well, but without them, we wouldn't have all of this. Where do we draw a line there and realize that, a building, the contribution, all of those things, that's not what the church is about. Those are things that the church needs, yes, but if we start basing our teaching, our doctrine, our stances on the funds or a person's influence, what could this person say about us in the community if we take a stand against them? Well, see, there again, we're letting their influence, their societal position start dictating what's truth and what's not. So all of those things could very possibly have been involved here. It would all be very good reasons why a person like this could be allowed to continue on in this fashion instead of having a stop put to it long ago. Anything else? All right, the best way to avoid ever getting into something that's this far and for it to ever become as divisive as what this situation had become is to be watching from it from the beginning and from the very first moment that those things start to happen, to have a strong leadership, strong eldership, strong Christians that are ready to step in and to take care of it peaceably, to abide by the doctrine, and to make sure those things are handled well. All right, so let's go on and read the last few verses here to finish off 3 John. Verses 11 and 12, John says, "Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. Demetrius hath good report of all men, and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true." So as John says, as we've already talked about, don't let the things that are going on stop you from doing what is right. And here's a couple other important points, that whenever there's somebody, even in the church, somebody that's behaving in a way that is unchristian, that is ungodly, that we should never let that become our excuse to give in to what they're doing, to justify what they're doing, or to just turn our back and to walk away entirely. There are a lot of people that will do that because of something they've seen that happened, and it may be absolutely wrong. They may be absolutely justified in saying that such and such did this, or this situation happened, it was wrong, and may absolutely be. But no matter what the situation is, or how many people were involved in it, or how many hurt feelings there are, a person's responsibility to God hasn't changed. And that's what John is getting at, is that don't let the evil of these people keep you from being the Christian you're supposed to be. And so he says, look to someone like Demetrius. Here's somebody else that John apparently knows, and apparently knows well. He says he has a good report of men and of the truth. Now those are two sometimes different things. Hopefully they go hand in hand. But just because somebody has a good report of men does not mean that they have a good report of the truth. And so one of the qualifications about our elders and deacons is they need to have a good report. They need to be somebody that people in general would look to and respect. Doesn't mean that they don't have enemies. Doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that might be saying evil things about them. But it means that those things can't be backed up with anything substantial, because they're above reproach in that way. They may have enemies, yes, but really their reputation to people that know them stands above and beyond that. And that's kind of what he's saying about Demetrius, is that this is a person that has a good report of the truth. John can say that as an apostle, as an inspired person of God, for he's speaking for God here, and God knows what's in the heart of Demetrius. He's a person who has a good report of the truth and a good report of men. And so look to somebody like that and to be bonded together. The best thing that Christians can do when faced with somebody that's trying to cause a lot of division and problems is to look to those others that are strong and are willing to stay unified in the truth and get very close to them and to be together. There's some strength and there's some encouragement in having some numbers. One of the things that might keep a person from going and dealing with a situation like Diotrephes is if they feel like they're going to have to do it alone. And, if you felt like you were the only person in this congregation that was going to stand up to something that was going on, when we're here on a Sunday morning with 150 people in the building, that's a pretty lonely feeling if you had to stand up and defy every one of them. But if you've got a bunch of people around you that are going to stand up and support you, and you're dealing with it that way, well then, that's a much easier situation to be in. So that kind of unity and that bond with each other is important always to have, making sure we're unified around the right things, looking to those people who are trying to do what is right, are willing to take those stands with us, are always looking to bring peace and unity as much as lies within us at all times. And so in the final couple of verses here, before we conclude, he said, I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee. Our friends salute thee, and greet thy friends by name. So as we'd mentioned at the end of 2 John, John is writing towards the end of his life as a much older man, and is still talking about wanting to go in to see these people. I think at the end of 2 John, we talked about his desire still to go and to travel and to be with his brethren face to face. He's writing them letters, but that's not the same. Today we might say even, emails and phones and the instant communication we can have from one side of the globe to the other, that's just not the same as being face to face with our brother. And that should be the desire, and John goes to a great length to still try to be with them as much as his physical condition will allow him to be. And so he offers them peace, a reassurance. They're dealing with some very difficult things, very difficult people. Reassurance of peace in them that God knows and understands the things that they're dealing with. And in the final phrase that he uses of greet the friends by name, they're speaking about people that obviously he knows very well personally, has a very close connection with. They have a close connection with each other. And he encourages them using very similar language to things that Jesus talked about and that John records in his gospel account of the words of Christ. In particular, I'd put up on the screen John chapter 10, where Jesus uses the illustration of sheep and says there in verse 3 that when he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And thinking about Jesus as being the shepherd of the flock, that he calls his sheep not just as, all you sheep, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, like you're a number in a great big system, but knows them by name, personally, individually. And later on in that chapter, in verses 27, 28, where he says that my sheep know my voice and they follow me. It's more than just looking at, the Lord doesn't just look at the church as just, one big glob of people, and that the ones that are falling in and out here and there don't mean much. It's every person individually that's known, and that seems to be kind of what John is pointing to, that if you could think of it as if the shepherd knows his sheep by name like that, well, the sheep should be practicing that same kind of thing amongst each other. To have that kind of personal connection, knowing each other deeply on a very personal basis, and that's the key to standing up to difficulties like what else was discussed here in this letter, of how we deal with those things as being on the right foot with God and the right foot with each other. So, anything else, final thoughts or comments about 3 John?
I just think it's interesting that how many times the word truth is used in this particular letter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Diotrephes was trying to steer them away from that, but I mean, you look at verse 3, verse 4, verse 8, verse 12, he's trying to steer them in that way. Stick to the truth.
Yeah.
Don't let somebody steer you away.
That's right.
You know what it is.
There's only one truth, and there's always only been one truth, and it really doesn't matter what Diotrephes or anybody else is doing or saying. The truth hasn't changed, and so neither should you. Is really the heart of what he's saying here, particularly to Gaius and everyone else that would read these words. It's that you know what to do, you know who you are, and you know how to deal. You should know how to deal with situations like this, and so be bold and be unified together in that. Anything else?
I think it kind of goes along with what Brother Mark was saying, was Paul was doing the same thing in Corinthians. And was it 14 in verse 37? Any man think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him knowledge of the things that I write to you are the commandments of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So I think John, when he's kind of summing this all up, he says, I'm going to be seeing you face to face here pretty quick. And I think he's letting the faithful brethren know we're going to take care of this Diotrephes, because he kind of mentions it back before he says, and I'll deal with this basically when I get there.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And so it's the truth is the same. John knows the truth. And you notice in these letters too, you just made me think of this, that as John is writing late in life, these are very short kind of letters. They're not long dissertations revealing new commands to people, much like many of the epistles, of Paul dealing with different issues in the church and how those things are dealt with. We're getting to a point in this early church history that, the word, for the most part, is revealed. The truth is known. This is how the church is supposed to be. And many of these people that John's writing to have probably been raised their whole lives in the church, some of them anyway. So again, when he talks about you know what the truth is and to stay in it, these are things that have always been a part of your lives. There shouldn't be any question about it. And so there's really not a need necessarily for John to go through and to re-reveal all the things that have already been said. He says, when I get there, we're going to take care of this in the truth. We're going to deal with it the way it should be dealt with. And we'll do it that way. There's only one way that this should be handled. So it's a very good thought just in thinking about ourselves too, that the truth is there and we have it for us. All right, so that finishes off 3 John. I said if we had a little bit of time, which next week will be the last week for a while that I'll be doing Wednesday night class. We'll have our meeting after that and then our summer series. But we were going to try to talk a little bit about the book of Jude if we have time. So what we'll do with the last few minutes tonight is to just say a few things about Jude himself. This is another short letter, but if we had time to go into it, there's a lot of things that Jude references that are interesting to go in and talk about, although sometimes I think some of those things, depending on how deeply we go into them, can almost be distracting from really the point of what Jude makes here. You can read the book of Jude and without having to go into every detail of everything he references, see the point that he's making, and it's very similar to what John has said, very similar to what Peter in 1st and 2nd Peter had to say. There's a lot of connections to be made in the same principles of what Jude has to say. So, to finish off this evening, though, Jude himself, let's just talk about a little bit about who Jude is. As best we can tell, he identifies himself in the text simply as saying he's a servant of Christ and the brother of James. And James is understood to be the same James that's prominently mentioned in the church at Jerusalem, and another son of Mary and Joseph, the earthly parents of Jesus. And so, putting all of that together, we would say Jude was likely a physical brother of Jesus. But it's interesting that that's not the way he introduces himself, and the way that he talks about himself shows his understanding of who Jesus is. That yes, maybe physically he had a blood connection to Jesus, at least through his mother, but he understood that Jesus was not like a common brother or sister that he would have, and that Jesus was the Lord and Christ himself. And so he doesn't reveal himself as I'm the brother of Jesus, look at me. That's the way, if this were Diotrephes, he would probably say that. Look, I'm the brother of Jesus. I can tell you about Jesus. Well, here Jude has a very different attitude. He's the servant of Christ, the brother of James, and in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 55, we have him likely mentioned where people are talking about Jesus saying, is this not the carpenter's son? And is not his mother called Mary, his brethren James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? So, as Jude identifies himself as a servant of Christ, the brother of James, he makes no claim to be an apostle of Christ at any point, and it's probably inferred that at very least through the early part of Jesus' life and ministry, and maybe not even until the time of his resurrection, that Jude was really a close follower of what Jesus was teaching, or even believing maybe at least fully that Jesus was truly the Son of God. Whenever we look into places like John chapter 7, there in the first 5 verses, we read about Jesus in the early part of his ministry, and it talks about his brethren there, speaking of his physical brothers. And it says, where they tell him to depart hence, this is John 7 and verse 3, depart hence, go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou doest. For there is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world, for neither did his brethren believe in him. It's almost kind of a mocking sort of statement of go and show these things. Even those closest to him didn't really believe at that time. Now, we don't know anything about at what point, if they would start to believe, but by the time we get to Acts chapter 1, we have these same brethren mentioned there as being with Mary in the upper room after the ascension. And whenever we're getting ready to see the beginning of the church, that by this point, any doubts that they had likely been erased, that they had seen Jesus risen, and they believed. And so Jude makes no claim to an apostleship, but we could assume that he was likely a very influential figure in the church, especially there in Jerusalem and maybe other places. We really just don't know anything else about his life. It reminds us, though, that there are a lot of people that had a huge impact on the church that aren't necessarily mentioned by name in Scripture. The apostles didn't do it all themselves. They had a lot of very important help along the way. Another question that we might always ask is about these writings and how they were included and put together with the other writings of the New Testament that we have, or their canonicity, we might say, in the canon of Scripture that we have. This was a writing that kind of, because of some of these reasons that we've talked about, of him not being an apostle and not having these just immediate connections of, yes, this is absolutely God's inspired word, might have been a little bit slower to be fully accepted at times, but as those through time that have put together the books that we have as our New Testament, we understand that they were not inspired people of God. They had no divine revelation given to them to piece these together. What they used largely was the tradition and understanding of those that lived much closer to the time. And this is a writing that's used by many early church writers, those back to the early 2nd and 3rd centuries, and many of the councils that came together in those time periods to start forming together what we know as the Bible, that all seem to be in pretty constant agreement of who the author of this was and its worthiness to be included in Scripture. And so most of the accusations or the objections to its being included often come from people that have a problem with the doctrine that it teaches. Kind of similar to like Martin Luther's opposition to the book of James, where when Martin Luther was opposing Catholicism, he brought people back closer in many ways, you could say, to Christ, but he had a big problem whenever James said that faith without works is dead. And so he essentially wrote that one off and said, oh, that's a book of straw, I think is the phrase that he used. It has no merit to it. Just ignore that one, basically. And so that's often kind of the way that people look at a book like Jude for some reasons that we'll talk about, especially in his urging people to stay faithful in the side of all the evil that's happening. In other words, even these Christians are in danger of falling away back into sin. Don't let that happen. As far as when it was written and exactly to whom, well, to who it was written, you can basically decipher that from the first verse. There's really not a person or a church that's given. To them that are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ. So whoever falls into that category is who Jude is writing to. Now he likely had a group of people specifically in mind that he doesn't name. And it's kind of interesting as you get into this letter, there, especially around verse 3, it very much seems to indicate that he had a lot of other things he was planning and working on writing and sending to them. But it seems as though there was something so urgent going on there that he stopped what he was writing and he wrote this shorter letter and got it out to them very quickly as kind of an urging, almost shouting at them to not fall into the dangers, to the things that were going on, that he was very much afraid that they were. And in this text, as you read it, it's very direct, it's very short, it's very stern, and it was likely spread throughout many of the churches around that area close to Jerusalem, Palestine, and Asia Minor. As for the date, there's really just nothing we can say about when perhaps it was written. And we might be reasonable to assume that much of the family of Jesus stayed there close to Jerusalem, and so it's possible that could be where the letter originated from, written by the hand of Jude. So it's about all we can say as far as, well, there's more we could say, but in a short and condensed idea, just to give a glimpse kind of who this is and where the mind should go as far as who this is coming from and its intention. It's kind of an urgent message of getting this out very quickly because of things that are going on that aren't fully explained, but we can see the ideas that are there. And Jude mentions in verses 3 and 4, he says, I'm writing you that you earnestly contend for the faith because there are men that have crept in unaware. And so think about back to John. We just talked about Diotrephes. I don't think Diotrephes came in guns a-blazing and telling everybody you're going to listen to me. This probably started at a much lower level. And before people realized it, he had taken over. Probably something somewhat similar to what Jude is dealing with, telling those that are faithful, much like John would, don't give in to these things, be strong in these things, and look back at many examples that you know of through history and through stories that have been told about people that did not keep their faith in God when things were difficult and what happened to them. And so it's really kind of a quick succession of referencing several other situations, some of which we know quite a bit about, others we struggle with a little bit to put exact heads or tails on every detail. But Jude is writing with that in mind. Think about all the examples that you have of what happens when a person is faithful to God versus those that give in to very strong temptation to turn against God. So next week, we'll kind of look through. We won't spend nearly as much time just verse to verse but we'll look through this book and kind of read through it and talk about at least the major points from the book of Jude.